Welcome to Read This Author's Corner. I am your host, Alice Maria James, and today I have with me a very special guest, the author of Life Lessons, Bryetta Calloway. Welcome, Bryetta. Welcome, Bryetta. It's so wonderful to have you. I'm so excited to talk to a multi-creative artist. I love talking to creative people. As a creative myself, it's just something that is so energizing. So before we get into the meat of your book, which is really all about you as a creative, just tell people about yourself. What do you want us to know aside from what we're going to delve into in the book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be talking to you. As you said, I love talking to creatives and I love talking to people who embrace, sort of all of the facets of themselves. So I think you and I share some synergy in that. I think the book covers a lot of who I am and sort of what my experiences have been. So I think if anything, I just want folks to realize that I don't consider my life to be anything, quote, special or unique in as much as that it's just my special and unique story. And I think part of why the book to me is important is because I think it really is a testament to folks embracing their story, like finding the words to articulate sort of what they've been through. Because if it connects with one or a few people, it's helpful for people to understand that people have seen or been through or experienced similar things. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah. I always feel it's good to know that you're not alone, right?
Yeah.
And that what you're doing is what you feel is almost legitimized. Like, that wasn't my imagination. That really just happened.
Yeah, it's really important. And I think especially for anyone who checks a box that makes them feel like an outsider or an other, I think it's really, really important because so much of the world around you will try to tell you what your experience should be. And as we know, no path is singular. And so yeah, it is really helpful when you read something, you're like, oh, that person has experienced something similar or seen something similar. It gives you a sense of community and also just ideas about how to navigate it.
Yes, very much so. So one of the things that I felt like I connected with you on is like, I've lived in 2 countries and 7 states. So but my movement has been self-inflicted.
You did that to yourself. Okay.
I did that to myself. I kind of enjoy that moving and learning and changing and, not getting so caught up in the familiar. One of the things I love about your book is that, like me, everything is a lesson and a learning.
I try. Yeah, I think it's super important because one, if you're not able to at least try to extract the learning out of it, much of life can feel purposeless, right? It can just be like, oh, well, this is happening. And if you're not really trying to understand the why of it or what can I learn from it, because, sometimes things happen and you can't seem to find the why of why it happened. But if you can extract some of the learnings, then all of a sudden you feel much more in control of your life. You feel more engaged with your life. But to your point about moving around, yeah, I'm a military kid. So like a lot of military kids, I moved very frequently throughout my growing up. My mom was enlisted in the Air Force. And so I've lived in places from Japan and Italy to Nebraska to Georgia, like many, many different places. And the thing that's so interesting about being a base kid or a military kid is that there's so much that changes and yet there's so much that stays the same, right? Like if you live on base, the military bases are designed in a way that if you've seen one, you've sort of seen them all. And there's such similarities no matter what country you're in, you know where to go to get your shopping done. So you're going to go to the commissary for your shopping, or you're going to go to the base exchange or the BX to do some of your other shopping. You know that there's going to be a library. You know that there's going to be, an after school like all of those things feel very similar no matter what base you go to. And yet outside of the base, everything is so different. And I talk about in my book, one of the things that I think my mom did exceptionally well is that she really pushed for us to, if we could, live off base inside of the communities that surrounded us. So we were really able to be embedded in a lot of the communities that we were with. So we got to live, in an Italian neighborhood, in a Japanese neighborhood. And those things were really wonderful experiences. It really broadens your perspective of life and people.
One of the things that you shared in the book was how your mom also kept the house familiar.
Yeah. Now she did. It's so funny to me because, I often talk about like, I don't know that my mom, listen, parenting doesn't come with a handbook. And so I don't know if these are things that she necessarily thought about in advance, but she certainly had very strong opinions about the fact that, if my kids are going to have to move to a new country, to a new school, to a new neighborhood, that she would try to keep some semblance of normalcy for us. And so again, they were these sort of odd experiences where you would move from like Japan to Nebraska, but you would walk in the house and it just felt the same, right? Like the living room's still there. Like maybe the configuration of the house was a little bit different, but like your furniture was still there. Your bedroom was still set up. She prioritized making sure that those things were set up immediately so that when we came in, we didn't really have to live in a lot of transition. So yeah, I think it did a lot for us to feel comfortable. It made us acclimate faster to our new surroundings. And for me, at least, it really instilled a sense of comfort, right? Like at least when I came home, everything felt the same. And that was really important when you're a kid who's about to go to like a new elementary school or a new middle school. Like all of those things are big and scary and different, but at least home felt the same.
My favorite chapter in your book, turn up the volume on your voice. And I think that chapter for me is the catalyst for this whole interview, because in that chapter is where you decided that instead of performing what someone else has written, you were going to create what it was, whether you wanted to sing in it or act. My first question to tie all of this together is, what do you think caused that revelation or that change to be so important to you that you are representing your voice instead of someone else's voice?
Yeah, I think it's critically important. And to your question about, well, what was the catalyst for that? I think the catalyst for that was a lot of pain and rejection, right? This idea that I could only make use or make best use of my gifts and my talents and my abilities if someone else said yes to me was a very limiting perspective. And, as an actor, as a performer, as a singer, someone who did this professionally, that's part and parcel of the game, right? Like you have to audition and someone has to see you as right for that role or right for that part. And there can be a myriad of reasons why someone says yes to you and why someone says no to you. And all of that is outside of your control. And it's not necessarily something to think badly about, but it's very limiting, especially when most of the people will tell you that they got into performing because they love to do it, right? And they're looking for opportunities to do that. And I think, again, going back to something that I said at the top, like if you check any box that is different, those opportunities becomes smaller and smaller, because ultimately the thing that's so interesting about sort of professional entertainment and professional creativity spaces is that for as creative as the individuals are, the machine that it's built in is not creative, right? Like it's a machine, and it can be very formulaic, and it can be, it can be very confining, right? We're only going to submit 3 actresses of color, or we're only going to have this number of people who look like this or sound like this. And so it gets highly competitive. It gets very difficult. And then your opportunities, if you're limited to that, your opportunities to do the things that you love get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then on top of that, if you have any sort of internal voice that's guiding the types of roles that you take, or the types of shows that you would be a part of, again, that gets even more limiting. And so for me, that sense of limitation was really hard to reconcile, because there was so much in me that I wanted to embrace and to do. And this idea of turning up the volume on my own voice was like, well, I'd written for years, but I would have never called myself a writer. I had done some like student directing, but I would have never called myself a director. Like these were things that I did, but I didn't really own them as a part of who I was. And by starting to actually own those things, it empowered me to say, oh, I can actually embrace the stories that I want to tell. I can actually embrace the narratives that I want to tell. And for me, this may not be the case for everyone, although I think it's a pretty unanimous benefit. For me, this unlocked a level of creativity that I would not have seen had I just gone the quote sort of formulaic generic path. This for me really opened the door for me to explore the types of work that I really wanted to see and be a part of. And also it added a ton of longevity, right, to what I could do and how long I could do it. So that for me has become like a prevailing lesson, because it started in this sort of creative space, but it's transcended into many, many different parts of my life, where it's a real benefit to ask yourself, what is it that I want to do? What is it that I want to say? What is it that I want to see? And find ways to embrace that as much as possible. It gives you a ton of power in your own life. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it also ties back to like your first lesson of conformity, right? Because by not allowing yourself to amp up the volume on your own story, your own voice, you're conforming to someone else's perspective of who you are, how you act, how you behave. I smiled when you said that although this is a creative space, it's a very it's based on formulas.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, that word doesn't want to come out of my mouth. But I spent 40 years working in the fashion industry. And
oh, so then yes, you absolutely get it. You absolutely.
And so I totally, completely get that.
Yeah.
And then people say, oh, but if it makes money, no. If they have a vision of what things are supposed to look like or be like, I always tell the story that for at least over 20 years, we've known that women weren't size 2 and size 8. And there has been no money that has moved it in the other direction to truly embrace another market, because they have a view of who looks good in their clothes. Mm-hmm. So it's not about, people say, will make sense or necessarily make money. It's whether it fits that formula.
Yes. And that's the thing that sometimes gets really difficult to reconcile, right? Like there is, because along the path, and because you are in fashion, I know that this is going to check the boxes with you. As you're training and as you're learning, there's so many people who are encouraging your creativity. And they're telling you, be as creative as you want, envision whatever you want. Like, they're really telling you to dream the impossible dream. And then you sort of transition into the business of it. And the message is very different, right? It's like, okay, we want you to be as creative as you possibly can. But the truth is, like, we've done the numbers. If we have more than 3 Black actresses in this film, it's considered a Black film, and we're going to have to market it to the Black community. And we don't want to do that. So, like, there's going to be a limited number of roles. Or I remember as I was auditioning, every audition I went into, someone wanted me to like riff and wail and gospel, and I could never, ever do nuance. And I was like, well, when do I get to explore that part of who I am as an actress? And it's like, oh, well, we love that you can do that. But like, listen, this is what we want, right? And we have to know that you can do that. And listen, I love all of those things, but that's very limiting for an actress. And so for me, this idea of, okay, well, I get it. There's a business part of that. And again, I don't begrudge that. I understand, I work in business. I work in corporate spaces. I understand the bottom line and what's necessary to keep a machine moving. But for the people who are in it, this is why it's critically important to find other ways of expressing yourself, of empowering yourself, so that you don't feel like, well, if they don't say yes to me, I guess that's it. Right. And what I've learned along the way, and I have to admit, it took me longer to learn this than I think some of our like younger actresses and creatives. Like I look at younger creatives coming up and I'm like, wow, they really seem to get it faster, which is, oh, I don't have to go this traditional path, right? Like I can explore other things. And if people want to work with me, they'll come to me to do that. And so, yeah, I've learned along the way that it's not just a nice to have. I think it's actually critical for people to explore the ways that they can sort of own their own autonomy in building sort of the type of career that they want.
I agree with you. I love the fact that the younger generation have seen what hasn't worked with the older generation and have found new ways, and they have new technology that you have to give yourself credit for that you did not have available to you.
Yeah, that's true. That's
so
true.
The fact that you recognize that I have new technology and I can use it in different ways. I saw that chapter on turning up the volume that really resonated to me with your principle, your lesson on conformity. And conformity is not necessarily a bad word, but it's an expected thing that we all look the same, we all talk the same, we all like the same thing. So talk to me a little bit about what that lesson on conformity means to you.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because as you were asking the question, I laugh because, when I was in high school, we had to pick a language that we wanted to study. It was like one of the things you had to do. And I remember so many people picked like Spanish or French, and I picked Latin. And I picked Latin primarily because I remember one of my friend's mothers said, this will really help you on your SATs when you know like what the words sort of mean and their base and all of that. And it's really stuck with me because as you were asking this question, I was thinking, well, when you think about this word conform, it means to be formed with, right? Like, and so as you said, not necessarily a bad thing until you ask yourself, well, what am I being formed with? What's the with that I'm being formed, right? And so that's a really important question to ask because sometimes we're so hungry to be accepted that we don't stop and say, do I actually want to be like this? Like, I know it's profitable. I know it's popular. I know it's accepted, but is this even what I want to be formed with, conformed to? So I think that's a really important question. And then the other thing is that there is some inequity in this idea of conformity, because for some of us, you have to go a long ways to conform, right? Like for someone, I have amazing friends who, for them, going from brunette to blonde is like the extent of what they need to do in order to make themselves more marketable, and maybe more accessible. And then for some of us, like, I can't change the color of my skin. I can't change sort of the way that I think, right? Like, so all of those things, I would have to go a really, really long way in order to make myself, quote, acceptable. And that's not adding on to the fact that, you can diet to your heart's content, and some people are just never going to be a size 0 or a size 2. I can't make myself taller, right? Like, I remember my ballet teacher, as hard as I worked, and I was an amazing dancer, but like, I'm 5'4", I'm not, they're not picking me for any of the like prima ballerina sort of things. That's just not my reality. And so, to your question about what does this mean? It means that, so you have to then divorce yourself from this idea that there is a singular standard by which you have to be measured in order to be accepted, to be seen as beautiful, marketable. All of those things are really, really difficult. And on top of that, in creative spaces, there's all of these sort of guardrails, right? Like back in the day, we used to call it typecasting. And so when you're talking about typecasting, you would literally see, I would walk into rooms and I would see 50 Black women who in theory looked like me, right? And it was because they were looking for a type. Now, again, none of these things are in theory bad, but it's certainly limiting, right? And it doesn't give you the ability to explore these other parts of yourself. And I think that's the lesson that I learned. It's like, none of these things in and of themselves are bad, but what they do is they limit your ability to explore other parts of yourself. And for me, it was really important to explore that, to be a Black woman doesn't necessarily mean that I always had to be the sassy best friend or had to be like, the around the way girl or riffing and gospel all the time. Like, all of those things are parts of the Black sort of a narrative, but it's such small parts. And I wanted to explore the idea that, Black femininity could be soft and could be sweet and could be nuanced and didn't have to be extroverted all the time, because those were the experiences that I saw growing up.
Right. I hear you.
You know what I mean? Like, that's what I saw growing up. That was sort of my real definition of what Black femininity was. And, again, we've moved, I think, in the right direction, but we certainly have a longer ways to go. But it's important to recognize that, because when you notice those gaps, you can say to yourself, okay, so then if I conform to this idea of
then
what,
it doesn't grow.
It doesn't grow, right? And we have to, there's many ways to push the envelope on something, and sometimes not participating in it is a really great way to force an industry to grow, or to at least acknowledge that this one little box that you're comfortable seeing me in is not enough to fully capture sort of who we are.
Say, I can truly understand and see that. And I know it has to be 100 times worse when you are the person looking to be chosen, and being in fashion design and technical design. And I moved out of the fashion design space into the technical design space because I had more control.
Yeah.
When you're in a room and you have someone that has on something like this orange, or you're choosing color, and someone goes, "Oh, we can't do that. No one looks good in that." They're like, "I look good in it."
I know what you're saying. I look amazing in this.
Okay. Things don't get chosen because the choosers It doesn't work for the choosers.
Yeah.
It does. And even when the chooser knows that the audience is broader than themselves,
Mm-hmm.
because they have the power to choose,
Mm-hmm.
they choose what works for them, not necessarily what works for the audience.
That's exactly right. And what ends up happening is that, unbeknownst to the general population, because I know that this is known by folks who run industries, they know that they are shaping the story that's being told. And I think oftentimes when you look at sort of our general audience, I say this beyond entertainment, I say this in business, I say this in brand and marketing. Audiences are smart, right? And we know they are. And so oftentimes we provide them a limited option because we want them to choose from 1, 2, or 3 options. Right. But we have seen that when we give the audience the opportunity to choose what they want, it is often more nuanced than what we offer them. It is often more indicative of a more unique perspective, because life is not a monolith. Like, everyone is living something that is uniquely different. And the beautiful part about when someone chooses to be authentic, right? And I talk about this in the book. It's like, and this isn't, again, just entertainment, because I also work in executive spaces, in corporate spaces. It's whenever someone chooses to be authentic, it opens the door for there to be another option. And that other option is really, really critical for all things, like innovation. How can you have new ideas when it's the same 3 folks or the same 3 perspectives? You need, I talk about this often with my teams, you need creative conflict. You need someone in the space who really does see it differently, or think about it differently, or comes from a very different perspective. You need that tension of pushing up against those ideas. And I often play this game where I'm like a 5-year-old and I just keep asking, well, why? They're like, well, it has to be. Well, why? Why does it have to be that way? Why does it have to be in that format? Why does it have to be those words? It's important not just to be contrary, but to push against some of these ideas that we just hold on to so hard and fast, because, to your point, and I think you said it wonderfully, because it just feels good to the choosers, right? It just feels more comfortable. And it's, comfort is not the ideal here, right? Like, it's a great, innovative final product.
Exactly. And that what I found in the fashion industry, where people would hold on to the formulas and what has worked over and over again, the only time that any kind of new creativity came in is when they bought a business, bought another business that was doing something totally different, that was selling. But you could have that same brain power within the organization and nobody would do anything with it,
Well, and you're so right. And the other thing is, and this is one of the things that I feel really passionate about, because with this message of, not conforming and being authentic, I also feel it's really important to balance that with the fact, and that's not always comfortable and pleasant. And I talk about this in the book as well, right? Like, there have been many, many times in my life where I've been in positions that were not comfortable, because I really was a square peg in a round hole, and I just didn't fit. The way that I thought about things, the way that I articulated things, it didn't fit. It didn't mean that I was in opposition with, but I don't have the same perspective that you have. We may share some perspectives, right? Like, I'll go into boardrooms now and it's like, yes, I share the same perspective of an Ivy League education, of a certain level of business acumen, but I'm not going to be able to separate the fact that, like, I'm a person of color, right? That is going to inform how I think about things. I'm a woman. That's going to inform how I feel about things. You know, the fact that I grew up in this military family and I've lived around the world, I'm someone who's really intentional about getting the perspectives of various different communities. And so sometimes that's not a comfortable position to be in. And I think it's really important for people to understand that just because it feels uncomfortable doesn't mean you're doing something wrong.
Right.
Most of the time, if it feels uncomfortable, you're probably doing something right. It's just really, really hard.
Always darkest before the dawn kind of thing.
You know, these things become sayings because they're true. Because they're true. Like, it really does get super, super hard before things break over into the other side. And again, once you sort of break through, you realize why it was so hard, right? Because, and especially for those who are envisioning a life that's bigger than maybe what they've seen before, bigger than what they've experienced before, when you break through, you realize that the barriers are there for a very real reason, right? Like, on the other side of that is, you know, an access to a privilege that for some folks is unimaginable, right? Like, I remember the very first time I realized that the salary that I had been dreaming of was pocket change to some other folks. And I was like, I just, you know, because I'm someone who follows my bliss and my passion, and I want to do the things that I feel good about. And I was like, it never occurred to me, right? I don't know that intimately the way other folks do. And this is the reason why, you know, businesses are set up in the way that they are. You don't have access to all of that information. And this is why it's hard for women to negotiate fair salaries and for people of color to negotiate fair salaries, because you don't even have perspective on what to ask for. And that's by design. It's by design.
Lesson on resilience. The hard part too is a lot of where the lessons come from, right? That's where to your second lessons, the resilience comes in. Because if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. Yeah. There would be nothing to talk about because we all would be there. But because it isn't easy, because it does require not nonconformity and the resilience. And resilience comes by going through those times that's really hard and you want to quit and you don't.
Yeah. You really, and this, you know, resilience is one of those words that, again, because I'm a writer, because I'm a performer, and, you know, in my professional career in marketing and brand, I spend a lot of time with language. Language really matters to me. And so resilience is one of those words that I think has become so overused that people really forget what it means. Right. And so we like the end result of the idea of resilience. It's like, okay, what is the phrase? I can take a licking and keep on ticking and I can bounce back and, you know, all of those things. And it's like, sure, but you understand to get to that point, you have to engage in difficulty. And not just once or twice, but consistently. Like, it's this consistency of difficulty that makes you resilient. It gives you the data to say, oh, I've been through this before. I can actually recover from this. And, you know, I talk about in my book, I think a lot of gardeners or people who are into plants will tell you nature teaches you so much about life, just in general. And this idea of like trying to create the perfect environment for something to grow is not always easy. I was just having this conversation with someone that just because something is natural doesn't mean it's easy. Right? Like, so I was actually talking about this with childbirth. I was like, you know, childbirth is natural, but it's not easy, right? And so we conflate these two ideas. When I started gardening, I would like plant my seed and and I just would wait. I'm like, okay, it's in the dirt. I'm going to water it and I should get something out of it. It's like, no, when your first seeds die and you're like, oh, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's try again. And then you start to dig a little more and you start to do a little more. But through the failings of that, you start to see these plants like really fighting to sort of break through and come through. And it's such a wonderful lesson about how beautiful something is at the end result. And this is, a lot of people are talking about the connection between growing your own food and appreciation of your own food. I have found that to be true. It's like when you eat your own tomato and you realize what it took to grow that tomato, you're like, this is the best tomato I have ever had because I know what it took in order for this to grow. And it didn't come fast. Right. And it took a long time and it had to withstand some prunings and some like planting it in a small pot and then transferring it into like, there's a lot of work that has to be done. And when you hear that, of course, that applies to real life. Of course, it's true that you have to have the conflict to push up against to realize, oh, I'm actually stronger than I thought I was. That's a great lesson to learn, right?
The favorite people was Jim Rowan's, and he always said, don't ask for things to be easier, ask to be better.
Yeah,
because
that's great.
In becoming better, that's where the growth is, right? Mm-hmm. So that has, for the past 40 years, that has been what guides me when I'm in this season of testing and trials and
right?
Yeah,
like, yes, that's what it feels like.
When you're in that season and you just want things to be easier, you just want to get to the other side. I take a deep breath and I'm like, okay, what do I need to get better at to get there?
That's the question. I love that you said that because I think that's the key that unlocks real growth, exponential growth, because going through hard things will teach you in some areas you're stronger than you thought you were, right? Like, when I went through recently with my mother's health, like to me, this was the most terrifying thing I had ever it was like the one thing I had dreaded my entire life. And I went through it and it was incredibly hard, like incredibly difficult. But I realized I was stronger in some areas than I thought I was. And so that was really important data for me. But the other one is the question that you asked. What are some areas that I am weak or deficient in that I need to get better at? Right. And those are good questions to ask, because if you're not curious about yourself and about what it is that makes you tick and what it is that makes you navigate the world, then you're missing the potential to grow up, mature, strengthen in some areas. And for me, that question has been the one that has unlocked so many things for myself. It's like, there have been some times I'm like, I got through that on the skin of my teeth. Right? Like I got through that, but that wasn't pretty. Right. Like, so what do I need to get better at in this? And and there have been some consistent lessons. And one of the things that I've really realized over the years is that there are some lessons that you learn again and again and again. You sort of learn them. I always say it's like deeper, right? Mm-hmm. Like you learn it deeper. It starts to sit more deeply in you. And one of the things is like, for me, a lesson always comes back to trust. Like, I just have to trust that I can do this. I have to trust myself that I'm stronger than I think I am. I have to trust that if I'm meaning to do good, that will matter in the end, right? Like, there are some things that I come back to again and again that really show me that there's just some areas that I will always probably need to rework or strengthen.
Life is a lot like just any kind of educational endeavor, right? You start off learning your ABCs, and then you learn cat and dog and 3-letter words, and then 4-letter words. And, and then you learn a sentence and a paragraph and then a book. And that's the way everything is. It's what the next thing you want to get to is, what are the new skills that I'm going to need? And what are the new skills? What are the new tools? What is the new environment? What is the new team?
Yes. And all of those things, like, this is the beautiful thing about life. Life is engaging with you, right? So it's not just Bryetta experiencing life. Bryetta and life are engaged together in this process. And so with that, exactly what you're saying is that every time you move into a new season of your life, a new decade of your life, what is it that I need to know in my 30s that I didn't need to know when I was 18 or 19? Lots of things, right? And it will be no different than when you're in your 50s and 60s, right? Like, I talk to my mom now who's in her 60s, and I'm taking from her those lessons of, like, it's really, again, you're still in that learning. This is the exciting thing about life. You're constantly being given the opportunity to get new tools, new skills, as you said, to navigate, because every season requires a different version of yourself. And hopefully, if you're doing the work, you've created a little toolbox that you take along the way of lessons where you're like, okay, I know that already, right? Like, that's something I feel really solid in, which means I can try this new scary thing because I know these things to be true already.
I turned 60 last year. In doing so, I also had some health challenges that I had to give up a career that I had done since I was 15. Now, knowing what that new picture was going to look like, I had no idea. And this was not it.
Wasn't it?
Surprisingly, it was a desire of my heart that I did not realize how it was going to manifest.
Yeah.
But on LinkedIn, they had this thing in 2021,
the Great Resignation.
The Great Resignation. That's the word I was looking for. The Great. And I had gotten a request to write something about it. And what I wrote is that you're never starting from scratch. You always bring all of those life lessons with you.
Yeah.
So that is your toolbox. If you have been a steward or a student of your lessons, then you should have a pretty well stacked toolbox of experiences that, although they might not look identical to the experience that you're going now, the principles are the same. The tactics are the same.
Yeah, I love so much of what you're saying, because my hope is that people will then understand, like, to me, this is what gives difficulty meaning. I am a person who's really clear about how you engage with me. There are certain things that I'm really clear, like, I don't accept being spoken to in certain ways. I don't accept people tripping over my boundaries. Like, mutual respect is a big thing for me. But I do that because as long as we know the parameters, that means it's safe for you to engage with me. I don't want you to, like, inadvertently trip up against one of my issues that I don't even know I have because I haven't done the work. You know what I mean? It's so turns out I didn't know that I'm offended by that until you said it, right? Like, I should know that about myself, even if you don't know how to stop it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like there are certain things where I'm like, I wish I was better at this. I'm not, but I know enough about myself to know that when I'm feeling this way, I will often say to my team, like, I'm going to disengage for today. One of the things I often say is, like, I'm feeling a little spicy today. So, like, I'm going to disengage because I know myself. I can at least try to create some guardrails. And that's why, all of these lessons that I've learned, it's like, it's not an exercise in only focusing on myself.
No.
Right. Because I never want people to think like you should just be spending all of your time thinking about yourself. It's like, it's not that, but the intentionality of really trying to learn yourself is really important, because if you don't know how to articulate to people, how to safely be in relationship with you, how to safely be in business with you, how to safely have conversations with you, then you're going to end up like not just you being hurt, but inadvertently hurting other people. And that's where it becomes like almost like a superpower for you.
Because once you recognize what affects you, even when you can't change it, you honestly understand that might not be someone else's intention.
Yeah.
That's not their issue. That's my issue.
Yes,
and because it's my issue, sit with it, deal with it, and go through it. Because when you don't recognize that it's your issue, not their issue, then you can kind of lash out or feel offended by something that is truly only your issue.
Yes, I say all the time, oh, that's a me thing.
Yeah, right? That's a me thing.
That's a me thing. And I love that you said that. That's such a great call out, because it's about that personal responsibility, personal accountability. We live in a world where offense is so prevalent. Everyone's offended about everything. And listen, the world is a crazy place, so I get it. But there is a certain level of personal responsibility where it's like, some people are doing the best that they can. Yeah. And like someone says something to you and they didn't mean to hurt you. They didn't mean to offend you. That's a you thing. And you get to decide if it's worth educating that person. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Right. Like, but for yourself, I think this is one of the most critical lessons of like our current day. It's like, do it for no other reason. Like, learn yourself for no other reason, so that you don't walk through life perpetually offended, perpetually hurt, perpetually feeling like the world is against you, people are against you. Because, I've gone through a lot of things. I've lived in a lot of places. And yeah, there's some really crummy, not so great things. But all in all, most people are good and kind and doing the best that they can. And we're all flawed individuals. And so like when you have flawed individuals bumping up against each other, it's bound to happen that that feelings get hurt.
Yes, exactly. Lesson on being assertive. So your third lesson. Now, why is this so important?
The antidote to like what we were just talking about, being offended or feeling like victimized by life and by people. The antidote to that isn't to be like big and brash and a bully, but it's that beautiful line of assertiveness. It's really important that you're able to articulate your value in a space. And that starts by knowing your value. It's really important. I say to folks all the time, when I'm in a situation, I will be the first to tell you what I'm good at. I will also be the first to tell you what I'm not good at. I will tell you, like, you don't want me for this, right? Like, that's not my area of expertise. But when you're talking about these sets of skills, I am the best person in this room for that. The ability to articulate your value and to be assertive in that is really important. And I often wrestle with this idea of, I don't want people to be so afraid of arrogance that they run away from confidence, right? Like, yeah, arrogance is gross, right? And nobody likes that, but confidence is necessary. It's really important to know what you're good at and to not be afraid to say that out loud, because the truth is, for many people are only going to see you a certain way. And it's really incumbent upon you to say, well, you can choose to see me that way, but I'm telling you that I have all of these other skills, all of these other abilities. And what I've learned over my life is that in every area where I experienced fear, this was an opportunity for me to gain confidence, right? Like, so now when I go into these situations where I'm like, oh, I'm feeling a little nervous, or like, oh, I'm feeling a little intimidated, I'm like, nope, this is a good place for me to test this skill. Whatever it is I'm intimidated about or afraid of, this is a really good opportunity for me to test that so that I can grow some confidence in that area, so that when I'm in the room, I'm not afraid to speak my mind, to articulate, to take up space, right? This is something I tell a lot of women, like, take up space, like, don't shrink because it makes other people feel comfortable. It's really, really important, and it will serve you well, because the more confident you are and the more capable you are of talking about your value and about what's acceptable to you, what's not acceptable to you, life gets easier. It just, I wish there was a more profound way to say it, but it's just the truth. Life gets easier. And ultimately what we want is to cut out all of the unnecessary difficulty, right? Because life is hard enough as it is.
Right.
We want to cut out that unnecessary difficulty for ourselves. So yeah, assertiveness is key for all people, but I would say especially if you're someone who's like trying to achieve big things or move in areas that feel bigger than you or uncomfortable, it's critical.
And thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, the depth of knowledge and experience that you shared in your book. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you didn't say that you wish to share?
No, I just thank you for the opportunity and for the platform. And I'm hopeful that for anyone who buys the book and who reads the book, that it serves as like a jumping off point for your lessons. Like, that's what I really want. I want you to certainly read mine, but I want it to be an invitation for you to say, wait, what are some of the things that I've learned that feel really important? And I want people to start engaging and sharing that with the people around them, because it really does help.
It's been a pleasure.
I loved it. Thank you.
I would like to thank my very special guest, Bryetta Calloway, the author of Life Lessons. Please pick up a copy so you can start evaluating your life lessons. This has been Read This, Author's Corner. I am your host, Alice Maria James. Keep reading, keep growing, and stay empowered. Until next time.